Foresight series. Good morning, my name is 𝘁𝗵𝗶𝘀 and I'm the Marketing Director at Stellenbosch Business School Executive Development. We are essentially the short course arm of the business school. So we develop and co-create with you, many of you, our clients, short management and leadership development solutions that are also certified by Stellenbosch University. So really on behalf of Ed and the Business Schools Alumni Association, welcome to the final webinar in our Leadership Foresight series for 2022. Can you believe it? So basically, these are my sort of stage gates to the end of the year. So it's quite terrifying, I must say. I am really pleased to see guests from all across the continent again, many familiar names from previous webinars. A big welcome to our clients and more specifically to some of our in-country partners. So for those of you that are new to the series, I'd like to give you some context in terms of the value that we are trying to offer you in the topics that we've chosen, as well as the theme, which is obviously leadership foresight. So, how wonderful would it be if we as business leaders had a crystal ball to see into the future? And that's really what foresight is, isn't it? It's the ability to predict what will happen and what will be needed in the future. But the future is obviously all about context too. So there are so many future scenarios based on what is happening, based on what's happened before and what is happening now. So there are many different futures that are possible. And we are hoping to address challenges that businesses are facing now that impact how you lead your people and the decisions that you make looking ahead by taking stock of the past and the present to see what happens in the future, so that you have what you need now to get there. And so today's webinar really explores the magic of the Ubuntu philosophy, which is very much an authentically African philosophy that is best expressed by saying, I am because of who we all are. Now, take a minute to really think about that. I am because of who we all are. How beautiful is that? And Richard Branson expresses his perspective of Ubuntu philosophy in business as a force for good. So, we get profit, we get business process and targets and KPIs in South Africa, and in South Africa specifically, we get the BE scorecard. But Ubuntu introduces the premise that good business can be achieved in parallel with doing good in the community, in the industry that businesses operate in the country. And also, very importantly, we have to consider what we can take from Ubuntu in terms of how best to lead our people within our organization, so our community of employees. So in the interest of time, I'm only introducing our webinar team very briefly, as you would have had an opportunity to read about them in the slides. And no doubt more of what they really do will come out in the conversation this morning. I am so pleased to introduce Dr. Natasha Winkler-Titus, who is Senior Lecturer in Organizational Behavior and Leadership at Stellenbosch Business School. Natasha will be steering the discussion today. Natasha is joined by by Dr. Joy Ntetha, who is someone who has the most inspiring and enviable job title. Joy is the Chief Visionary Officer and Healer at the Nomanlanga tribe. Welcome to 𝘁𝗵𝗶𝘀, Head of Community and Special Projects at Yebo Fresh. And finally to Yesthiel Singh, who is General Counsel and Company Secretary at IQ Business South Africa. So before we start, I'd like to quickly go through the order of proceedings. Please keep your video on if possible, especially when you're asking a question. But while the webinar is underway, please also keep your mic off. And there will definitely be time at the end for questions. But please, so that you don't forget your questions as we go, please type them in the chat box throughout. And Natasha and myself will address the questions as we go, so as not to lose the momentum. Obviously, if you'd also like to ask the question yourself, that would be wonderful. So that's it for me for now. Over to Natasha with our sincere thanks. I hope that you enjoy.
Thank you so much, Kerry, and thank you for USB Ed. Obviously, being part of the business school, it's an extension of us, so it always feels to me like I'm home and part of the family. But thank you for the opportunity to, and I love that, to start the conversation, not to lead the conversation, but to start the conversation. It is also something that is close to my heart, and it's always been embedded in the work that I do. So to get us going, I'm just going to position this whole idea of Ubuntu leadership and share a few slides and share a few thoughts before we jump into it, just to make sure we're all on the same page. So I'm so glad Kerry went to leadership principles, and the ethos at Stellenbosch Business School is about responsible leadership. And responsible leadership promotes the idea that the influencing power of leadership should reach beyond a single organization toward improving society, and the world, highlighting people, profit, and planet. So it's not one or the other, but that we do it in combination in a triple bottom line of organizational success, or as I would like to refer to it as significance. But responsible leadership is also deeper than just a role, or it rather represents some form of agency that gives meaning to what is responsible, but also what is possible. So therefore, a key component of responsible leadership and competencies include the doing bit. What do we actually do? And that's really where we are going with this conversation, to learn from people that we believe are holding this, and they're not just talking about it, but they are doing it in the businesses that they are in, or in the what they're reading. I just wanted to make sure my sound is okay, because I am getting feedback that some people are not getting sound through.
Yes, your sound is fine.
Thank you. Okay, so research involving indigenous perspectives, because we must remember Ubuntu as a philosophy is indigenous to the African people. So there has been much research around indigenous perspective, and that research is quite diverse. And I'm putting up a paper if anyone's interested in reading. Salmon and company have looked at the literature and what we know about how indigenous perspectives has infused management theory. And it's quite diverse. There's a number of tangible research streams where they articulate and compare different indigenous epistemologies, individual and community-based entrepreneurship, and also the influence on colonization on current day interactions. We must remember it's not just South Africa or African continent that has been colonized, but it's a phenomenon that happened worldwide. And so the current day interaction between our history of colonization and our indigenous people and the modern institution, how do we deal with that, and how do we infuse that in our business? So although the literature has continued to grow, and we are making brilliant contributions, it's still dispersed. And again, we still don't have enough of an African perspective, and especially bringing the Ubuntu philosophy. So much of the management theory that we currently have that infuses our education, that is in the textbooks that we use to teach and to facilitate learning, that management theory is still predominantly westernized and based on writings of the early 20th century Western scholars, whose disciplinary orientations tend to be heavily grounded in economics and classic sociology. And these writings depict Homo sapiens as individualistic, utility maximizing, transaction-orientated species. So in contrast to that, recent scholarship has started to reveal more gender and racial ethnic biases in these type of theories, and shown them to be invalid models of our human nature. Humans inherently are social and communal beings, and along with our rationality, we are also guided by our emotions, which all sits in the brain, as we know. So to look at the human as a rational and individualistic being is actually more of a westernized infused approach. Therefore, we've started looking, and we have already experienced how Eastern philosophy has had a positive impact on the areas of business process. So if you're working in business process engineering, for example, things like total quality management, you'll remember the Kobayashi principles and how that has informed Lean and Six Sigma thinking. Also, on the Eastern side, the knowledge of emotional intelligence, how the principles or ideas of Ikigai has informed how we think about business and leadership. So now, and I feel quite strongly about that it is time and it's our responsibility as Africans to operationalize the Ubuntu philosophy toward more responsible leadership, and also how to conceptualize it in more positive social capitalism, another word that is being branded out there. Now, Dr. 𝗁𝗲𝗄𝗧 is one of the pioneering thought leaders who operationalized the Ubuntu philosophy as a conceptual framework for interpersonal relationships and leadership. His book, Ubuntu Bota African Humanism, aimed to reposition African ideas of communalism and African humanism as germane to the continent and its philosophy, while extending these beliefs in corporate life. Ubuntu is taken from a Nguni word or aphorism, 𝘁𝗵𝗶𝘀, which can be translated as a person is a person because or through other people. And our very beloved Desmond Tutu also said, you know, none of us come into the world fully formed. We are highly dependent on other human beings to teach us things, to help us walk and talk and grow. So we need other human beings to be human. The ancient concept of Ubuntu is reported to have originated in Central Africa within the earlier societies. And as certain groups of people migrated to other parts of the continent, they took the Ubuntu philosophy with them. Ubuntu philosophy is at the center of how organizations can evolve into more inclusive and purpose-driven corporations. Examples of this has been evidenced through the use of open, innovative platforms, where individuals embrace external cooperation and idea generation. And you'll see in one of our examples at Yebo Fresh how they've actually made that part of their mandate and their operating model. Where Ubuntu principle emphasize things like connectedness as opposed to just association for gain. It encourages social organizational culture that allows personal growth and a sense of a communal achievement as opposed to individualistic performance drivers. The capacity to express mutuality and compassion, reciprocity in humanity is setting us up for success. Even if you look at our example today, our online communities. Now, 𝘁𝗵𝗶𝘀 was one of the first people in South Africa to earn a PhD focusing on Ubuntu. And he subsequently published his book, Ubuntu Management Philosophy, in 2005, which captured the essence of the Ubuntu philosophy and explained how it is used in management philosophy in modern businesses. And the 8 basic Ubuntu core values then followed, including compassion, forgiveness, responsibility, honesty, self-control, caring, love, and perseverance. And further on, as research developed in this space, these principles were also expanded upon by 𝘁𝗫𝗀, who stated that Ubuntu is grounded in 5 levels of management application, which he called the 5 Ps of Ubuntu, which is people-centeredness, permeable walls, partisanship, progeny, and productivity. So that's enough of me setting the scene. Let me stop sharing and get into the conversation. Now I feel like a lecturer on the USB executive programs. So let me get my panel with me into this conversation. And I'm going to start with my lovely friend and co-work psychologist, Dr. Joy. So all 3 of you, Dr. Joy, Yesthiel, and Simon, thank you again for sharing this conversation with me and with us at Stellenbosch Business School. And maybe just to set the tone, Joy, if you can start us off, can you position yourself? I just want to ask you to position yourself in this whole Ubuntu philosophy. And what does it mean to you at a personal and a professional level? Joy, please.
I think that's a very great question to start off with, especially Natasha, since you've really laid great groundwork in just explaining what it is and the sort of change and the shift that we've seen in literature as we try to infuse our business studies, organizational studies with contextual specific lenses as well. And I must say, I was one of those people not too long ago that, you know, was this global scholar in Africa that went out there to go find like the best leadership sort of development practices and solutions. And of course, you know, as Africans, there's almost this conditioning that the first world will have these solutions. You go out there and that's where you get these amazing sort of solutions. And as I did on a very prestigious scholarship with the Fulbright Scholarship, which in essence is trying to promote multiculturalism and understanding across different, I mean, we 156 countries in the world. I got the opportunity to really speak and learn from different leadership scholars around the world and even get to almost the forefront of what a paradigm shift that has been talked about globally, which is around moving from this very, as you're saying, individualistic, very heroic, the hero is the one that has all the answers and the solution type of paradigm, to a paradigm where we're seeing how volatile and uncertain and unpredictably complex the world is becoming, where we're seeing the need to shift into a leadership paradigm that maybe involves multiple stakeholders, maybe involves seeing an organization within an ecosystem where you're seeing the need to align leadership philosophies to contextual sort of realities that are happening. And as we're talking about this post-heroic shift, I said to myself, and I was listening to this in Edinburgh, in Scotland, actually, in 2016, I was like, this sounds awfully familiar to just wisdom that I've heard at home around a leadership that is a bit more collaborative, a leadership that is shared, a leadership that is distributed, that is looking at the follower in the context as well. And some scholars go to the extent of it's not about either or shifting only towards post-heroic, but it's about finding a way of the interconnectedness between the self, which can be socialized as an individualistic human or a collectivist sort of human, right? In the context, though, of the collective, which is why I think when Kerry started with the I am because we are, it moved for me from a very philosophical, feel-good statement to a scientific statement that holds the frame, that's able to connect that leadership is actually a combination of your personal self-leadership, which you shape and which is shaped by your context, together with the, because we are, the process of it collectively becoming a thing that multiple people, or it's a group quality effect that happens as we come together as a force for good, which is the direction in which business is sort of going, which is why now we're even having this conversation at the business school executive development of, well, if we're asking for more humanness and Ubuntu in business, how do we do that as a combination of looking at actual leadership competencies that I've been told, that I've been said are the ideal? Can I challenge that with myself and look at the context of what the whole actually sort of requires? And for me, that's how it almost shifted from the personal self, me also going out there, going to look outside of myself, solutions, and actually coming back 360 to wisdom that is inherently from the soil of where I come from, but also makes sense in the bigger global conversation of post-heroic leadership. And I think that already sets a much more capacious sort of tone in us talking about Ubuntu, not only as an exclusive exotic thing that is ours, but as something that already in its essence and its principles is embedded in where the direction of new business philosophy, new leadership philosophy is going.
Thank you, Joy. Yeah, sometimes we have to leave to appreciate what we have when we come back again. So it's such a brilliant, because that is exactly the principle. We are, we continuously look at the global north for answers and for guidance, and we forget that we are actually the founders of humanity right here. We need to go find the roots. Simon, I want to bring you in the conversation. I don't want to highlight Yebo Fresh just yet, but I know, even though you have a role in Yebo Fresh as a leader, but as a person, and I've had the conversation with you, you almost live that passion of what Yebo Fresh stands for. And thank you, Kerry, put the link in the website if anyone wants to go and see what this is about. But if I could just ask you first, just as Simon Peters, how do you come to this philosophy of Ubuntu? What does it mean for you personally and professionally?
Yeah, I think I've been on a journey. I mean, as look, I come from the cold north, and there obviously there is community, was community. There's an evolution of community there, and I now find myself on the tip of Africa, and feel wholly at home. And so there's been a journey of discovery, and I think Ubuntu, like I think I as myself, my normal behavior default setting would be to be the hero, to be looking after me, going after it myself, making the solutions happen. Coming from an entrepreneurial background, I think that is typical, that you kind of need to grit and bear it, get through the pain. You need to do it because no one else is going to do it for you. It's hard, so toughen up and pick yourself up. But that is a journey to burnout and destruction. So there's, I think on discovering this concept that previously maybe I knew in a small way, from a different background, but exploring it more, I think the concept that I see you is at its core, because I'm not just seeing myself and what's in it for me. Like if I see you and I see then start unpacking, how are you connected to me? How do we help each other? What is your struggle? What is my struggle? What is my experience? But what is your experience? Like, how do we come together? That's very freeing, because firstly, it takes the weight off of me doing everything on my own, which is unsustainable. But actually, there's a fullness and a lightness in that, because you're not taking things too seriously. And actually, as a creative thinker, and I think that's where probably personally I have most success, is seeing things differently, coming at life with a different perspective. And being able to creatively ideate new ways and see new possibilities. My mind is broadened by seeing your perspective and your background and your lived experience, because that opens up possibilities. I might not have had previous experience in that area. I may not have lived your life, but actually the combination of the two allows me to express maybe some part of a solution, or at least start walking the road with you to a solution to a problem. I think maybe later on we'll get into why that helps business and creates business opportunity, but personally, I think that's where I come from.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Simon. And you just reminded me, I just, this past weekend, actually reread the book Ikigai. Yeah, sometimes we just have to reread these things to remind ourselves of the principles. And one of the principles of longevity, so in Ikigai they go to Japan and try and understand why these people live till 100 plus. When they're 80 they young, they juniors, and they interview, and one of the core principles, there's a few, I think there's 5 rules about how you eat, how you keep busy, etc. But one of the core principles there is the sense of being in relation, doing things with people. And it was such a good reminder as well. But I also want to, Yesthiel, when I have the executive development program groups, and it's unlike the MBAs that we have a 2-year journey with them. EDP, I've got 1 or 2 days to do my magic and sprinkle a little magic dust on them. But we have a whole day where we talk about responsible leadership, and by the end of the day, we have a little movement going. Everybody's fired up how they're going to change the world. And then we realize that we go back into the real world, because the real world is so tightly knit by a different way of thinking. It's infused in our systems, our processes, and you have the enviable task today of holding that. For me, you kind of represent corporate South Africa. Fortunately, you're in an environment that's a little bit more forward thinking, but you're sitting in that space. So what does Ubuntu and Ubuntuism mean to you personally and your professional career?
Thanks, Dr. Natasha. I think Dr. Joy and Simon gave a very good outlet in terms of the view from the outside in, from an international perspective. I'm bringing the view from the inside out, just from my personal perspective, because of the experiences and the people who I've associated with. Without the mentors that I've had, the diversity of exposure to different cultures, as an Indian growing up in Durban and going to a white school, a mixed school, I've been so grateful and blessed to have had these diversity of experiences to learn. Because I think learning from those experiences, as Simon touched on, and from the different cultures and values and principles, really help to make us who we are and to embrace that as an African topic. I think when we talk about, particularly when I look at it from my age group, when we embrace our Africanism, principles like Ubuntu, Tuma Mina, etc., effectively, I think those are inherent to who we are. And I'm hoping that those type of principles differentiate us from our international counterparts. So I'm really grateful from that perspective to have had all of those experiences. And it's really given me a variety of skill sets, which I believe have benefited me in the corporate world. Because as Dr. Joy alluded to as well, we're seeing a big shift, especially post-COVID, where people were so focused on just profits. We're now going back to the human element, back to the community element, because we've had some time to do a lot of introspection. And I think one of the principles of Ubuntu, we look at survival. And how do we survive? We survive through community and by supporting each other. And Dr. Joy touched on ecosystems, creating ecosystems to uplift each other, to grow each other. So from a personal perspective, I've noticed that. From a professional perspective, I've also noticed a big shift towards employee, relooking at EVP, relooking at what are the organization's values, and does that align to our purpose? Are we a purpose-led organization, or are we a profit-led organization? And how do we balance those? And I'm seeing a big shift towards companies becoming purpose-led organization and making sure that their values enable that. And I think that's becoming more prominent in corporate, not just in South Africa, but also internationally when we start looking at ESG principles, and we'll touch on that later in the conversation as to that shift. And a very human focus coming through from the corporate world to focus on employees and the broader community, and creating ecosystems to support each other. Because if we can do that from a community perspective, effectively we all benefit. We grow South Africa, we grow Africa, and we grow each other and support each other. So I think from a corporate perspective, I think we're really seeing a shift, which I'm really passionate about, like the others on the call. So really looking forward to get into the conversation and unpack this as we go along.
And we're in there, guys, we're in the conversation, because by just sharing your own principles and philosophy, you're starting to make it quite tangible back into corporate SA. Yesthiel, you shared you personally would not have progressed in your career has it not been for mentors. So what does that speak to? Talent management processes in organization. How is mentorship done? Because that's also the sense of community. So you guys have, in fact, already given us quite a few pearls of wisdom. I want to pick on something. So if we get to the core of Ubuntu, and I really want to keep emphasizing that Ubuntu is not just humanity in the be nice, be kind, love people. You know, it's a very soft and hard principle, philosophy. It's as we care and love each other, we also hold each other accountable. As we do good, we also do good in a sustainable way so that we can take care of future generations. So there's something that's been irking me, and in responsible leadership, ethics and ethical dilemmas, a core conversation that we had. So Ubuntu has a very strong focus on communalism, you know, the community, we all in this together. Yesthiel, as somebody that holds, and sorry, I'll just throw titles and responsibility on you guys, you know, and you hold corporate legal counsel, you know, and I will say people with a legal background is very much about the rules and staying within the border and do the right thing, etc. How do we marry this thing of community and we all in this together and we all with accountability? Because, you know, in organizations, we always say somebody needs to be responsible because somebody must be accountable. We can't have a team accountability. How does that sit with you, and what's your thoughts on that? How you marry this idea of communalism with accountability?
So a very good question, Natasha. And there's two lenses to look at there, both from an international perspective, and I'll give you some insights there, and also from a South African perspective. From an international perspective, we're seeing more organizations, and my organization in particular, getting involved in international impact recognition like B Corporation. And I'll share the link to the B Corporation ratings, which effectively is a certification based on one's social and environmental impact. So there's a number of things which they look at, like collective action, your stewardship towards the environment, fair wages, working engagement, where they really deep dive into the data and those specific metrics in order to recognize you as a B Corporation, which makes you effectively competitive in the market. And I think a lot of organizations, we've seen a shift in Africa because it's been embraced internationally, are looking at undertaking B Corporation certifications, etc. I think from a South African perspective, when we look at it in terms of marrying Ubuntu, which, as you mentioned, could be quite a philosophical, nice, fluffy thing which we talk about, etc. And how do we make that tangible? When we look at South African corporations, they have, if they have a particular PIC score over 500, what's called a social and ethics committee, where this theme has a very broad scope, and we have committees with non-executive directors tasked by the board to make sure that businesses are focusing on these themes. I think Kerry touched on earlier, we have BE, which also talks to Ubuntu, is how do we bring the community? But I think we go one step further in terms of social and ethics committees, which are specific governance metrics, which look at our impact on the environment, look at our impact on the community. How are we supporting community? And it's beyond CSI. What impact do we have? What reporting are we implementing so that these are actually measured and we're not just talking about the conversation? So there's a responsibility on boards now, right, to apply this focus. And effectively then the boards hold executive management accountable for making sure these philosophies are transposed into business and as usual. And it's not just a nice to have. And we're seeing business embedded in their values. I'm also at my organization, we have our formula for success, right, which are our values coupled with a set of behaviors which dictate everything we do, right? So in there, we talk about 𝗁𝗵𝗶𝘀, community, Ubuntu, etc., as core behaviors and elements of focus, which not just leadership, but the entire business need to take into consideration in the actions that they're doing, whether it's with the broader community, whether it's with our partners, whether it's with our employees and our duty of care to each other. So that focus of Ubuntu and community and respect and dignity at the forefront of that has really got a focus now, and we measured on it in terms of the data and what we look at from an accountability perspective. So I think excellent, I think, in terms of the legislature and Companies Act in terms of implementing this and making sure that we're intentional about it and not just talking about it. So companies are really forced to now make an effort towards this, and I think it's making South African companies and African companies who also embrace these philosophies more competitive. Because there are benefits to it, and we'll touch on it a bit later on as well. Yeah.
I love the fact that you threw that word competitive in there. Dr. Joy, I get a sense, I can feel you here in Cape Town, and I know you want to jump in there. You have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I love that, I think Yesthiel knows my obsession around just B corporations, because for me, they're really systemically at a macro level are definitely one way in which we can offer some guidance and some standards for accountability going forward. And I think the onus is also on us as, interveners and work psychologists to also kind of shift our interventions to reflect that as well. Like when I am coaching, what principles am I applying? When I am developing, for instance, inclusive leadership or inclusive management as a toolkit, particularly to drive these things, because we don't want them to only stay at the macro tick box level. Yes, now the board has sight of it, etc. We want it to also kind of infuse our sense of belonging within these spaces, but also be felt. So that means that leaders, yes, within the titles and outside of the titles, also carry what the principles you referred to earlier, Dr. Natasha, around responsible leadership at a very personal mastery type of level. I feel as if sometimes when we think about the 𝗁𝗵𝗶𝘀 concept, it becomes so big, and looking at these big ideas. But what we try and do now is definitely in my work is to go back to the individual within your sphere of influence and seeing how can you rehumanize your business? And that marker from the Nomanlanga tribe around rehumanizing business and rehumanizing leadership has been another way to infuse some of these principles in the programs we design, so that we also are, placing our own leaders on a global footprint and stage, that they're able to hold space for these big ideas like the triple bottom line. We spoke about, I think I saw in the comments, the profit-led and purpose-led. It's not either or, it's like all three, the triple bottom line, where it's now this added responsibility to start seeing how that looks like in your own space. And that means really shifting from the inside out. And we can go later on in some of the fundamentals for us that we found have been critical, just as little shifts in how you lead with an Ubuntu sort of inspired base as well later on.
And I love that. I love that it has to start with you. And when we teach responsible leadership, we say you lead at 4 levels. It starts with personal mastery, then the relationship and followership, then the system, and then planet as a whole. So you don't hold a position to lead the planet. Maybe the head of the United Nations holds that job, but we don't. Yet we are all responsible for the planet, And having said, so that agency, Simon, if I can bring you in there, we had a brilliant question from Michelle Mayer, who said, how do you shift a profit-led organization? And I really want to emphasize, every time I hear Yebo Fresh, I just get thirsty. I just see these fresh juices, But you part of an organization, a very inspiring organization that's not a little not-for-profit charity do good. No, it's a proper profit-driven organization, sustainable organization, not dependent on charity. How can one shift a profit-led organization where there's wide-angle empathy, and some of them don't exist, but I think in Yebo Fresh is really infused? Can you share with us a little bit about the Yebo Fresh story and the operating model, and how do you make it practical as a business?
Yeah, sure, thanks. So I think Yebo Fresh was born, I guess, out of a direct need. So there's a challenge in inequalities of access to food in much of South Africa, and that was the genesis, kind of that starting point for Yebo Fresh. Seeing that, realizing it, and then thinking there must be another way. And I think that how that's translated into, I guess, steering the business in that direction, even though it's for profit. It hopefully one day will be a corporate, a large scale business that is able to take that solution to an even greater scale. That's the journey we're on. I think the core of positioning a for-profit business to attack key social issues, or to embrace Ubuntu, is to have purpose and mission, like kind of steering your ship. So I think in true business terms, you would want your vision and mission to be aligned with the whole of the business. And that should interrogate every decision you make. It should set the culture for the business. You've basically got a plumb line for how do we do things around here. And that can be outward looking, and that could be inward looking. That's how you treat your staff, and that's how you treat your customers, or it's how you make strategic decisions. If you haven't thought about your vision and mission, if you haven't updated them, made them more relevant, if you have them on a piece of paper, on a plaque on the wall, and you just disregard them because we're looking at just the bottom line, or we're just looking at profit and shareholders and growing this machine, then I think you lose track very, very, very easily. And it becomes more inward looking. It becomes more about us and not all of us. And so I think that is what we keep coming back to. The temptation is always to stray off of that. We all get distracted. We all within business will have choices to make. And I think if you have a good, solid kind of purpose-driven vision and mission that you can keep coming back to and keep directing employees to, so, no, this is how we do things here. This is why we're doing this. Then I think that's a great step towards actually driving you in the right direction.
Thanks for sharing that, Simon, because that is the key, isn't it? Just it's about balancing this people, profit, planet, purpose. We in a talk the other day, one of our finance directors said, it's all good, but because we asked, what's the purpose of business? And they said, to make money, it's to make profit. And there's a part of me that don't disagree. When and I'm a people expert, but if I go into business, I tell people we are not here for employee engagement. We are not here for employee wellness. A hospital exists for people's wellness. That's their mandate. Okay? So let's not get confused with that. We must realize we're here for a purpose. Our purpose is to serve a community by providing food, service, or whatever. But it's how we do that, who we do it with, and are we all part of that mandate, or are we workers, or are we minions in that? You brought in the complexity and the pace, and I want to go then, and I want to ask Joy and Yesthiel to reflect on this. The world is shifting, and everything seems to be on steroids. It's just quick. That's thing called a VUCA, as Prof. 𝘁𝗵𝗶𝘀 loved to say, a VICAS world, So leaders have got more and more pressure, not just leaders, everybody in the business, to solve problems quicker, to make decisions quicker. And then you have these Eastern and this African philosophy that says we have to slow down in order to be fast. We have to engage widely. Now, if you're a leader that has to make a decision quickly, but then we also say, but you have to engage the system as you're making the decision. How do we reconcile that when there's a demand for pace and faster decision making? And Joy, you use the word post-heroic. You know, there is a thing called hero leadership, where the leaders kind of set up as the hero, and we post that. The leaders don't have all the answers and solutions. How do we infuse, how do we reconcile what seems to be the need in the world to this Ubuntu principle of more engaging community decision-making, be consultative? Just practically, how do you get that right? Can I start with you, Joy?
Yeah, and I think it's good to really get it down there to at the practical sort of level, especially in the business context. And for me, I want to go back to the self and the collective, because sometimes that's where the issue comes, when you think that you are separate from what's happening in the outside world. It's like that's something that's happening in the macro, and then there's me. But I think what I found just in the last year, as Yesthiel mentioned, around just the personal reflection time that we've all sort of had to transform our own inner worlds. In fact, when I founded my organization, what was so critical in our purpose is to connect the inner and the outer world, because it actually is connected there, and the revolution starts internally within you. So a lot of the focus has really been going back to, for me, knowing that Ubuntu is also connected to not just each other, but the actual earth around us. So that in its essence means slowing down our nature to follow the pace of nature, if that sort of makes sense. So for instance, when you look at how African society thrived in the olden days, they were following a much slower pace and looking at how the stars were related and how that connected to seasons and how that influenced when you go harvest and what you harvest that year and how much and what angles. And that created a lot of abundance in African society, just following nature and the pace of nature. And I found that in my own life and looking at my own daily routine, when I started just following a natural routine around the well-being of things, and I love that you mentioned that, for instance, around hospitals being the core purpose, Dr. Natasha, I feel as if Ubuntu is about the well-being of all things and being in harmony with that and all of life. So when I started aligning my natural sort of day to what's happening around me and kind of slowed myself down and didn't try to go ahead of what I think, okay, I need to have all these answers set and then I need to go this, I lose sight on actually what's happening in the moment in context, which is why the three fundamentals that I always speak to when it comes to then almost pragmatizing Ubuntu as a philosophy from a leadership perspective is, number one, the human is always in context. So look at the natural context in which you find the person, because how we lead is then infused in the language. And you're seeing that a lot, Dr. Natasha, even in the corporate spaces where people can now, our generation can now use our indigenous names. That alone is like a win. Whereas I know my mother's generation had to now find English names that will be easily palatable for the corporate space. Now there's a different shift in that generation in acknowledging language and context and how to pronounce these names. This is something that's adopted also globally. When you look at LinkedIn, now it guides you. This is how you pronounce my name. And for me, I think it's those evolutionary things that we infuse also in the system contextually, and not only the big revolutionary change of business models. We need to also give room for the little evolutionary shifts where now when we see the organization in context, we're not only kind of facilitating town halls where it's one-way conversations, but learning from, for instance, the mining indaba. You're facilitating an indaba where you actually are now having a conversation that is showing that I don't know all the answers. Imagine if a CEO would start a year like that, and instead of, you know, these very impersonal survey dipsticks, it's actually roundtable indaba conversations that are facilitated by the leaders themselves and are in touch with the context. So that's fundamental one. The second fundamental is around how the human will always seek meaning and connection. So regardless of the different business units that we put that can have different ways of how we do things around here, the importance of an overarching culture driver that pulls people together around connection is the one thing that we found is important. And in our sessions, in the work that we do, I know Yesthiel always says this in the programs and that we run within corporates around, sometimes you might need to go outside of business hours to just connect and build a relationship with someone so that you know them in a broader context. And that actually makes relating a bit better, and it becomes a more of an inclusive sort of conversation. And then the third one, what happens when we start leading together, we distribute power and resources, and that becomes this unintended consequence as well of like, well, now I'm leading in the context of a group. What does that mean? What do other people need? So then leaders, when you are sort of delegating and including other people in the leadership practice, are you giving people the resources and the power that's also needed to effect change and influence decisions within those spaces? Those three fundamentals alone, when we start showing up as leaders with that context in mind, that need of relating and connection in mind, and lastly, that sort of understanding that we need to share power and resource as well, starts moving it from this feel-good thing to a tangible thing that I can just start doing as I lead the people within my team of 5, for instance.
I love that, Dr. Joy, and I think just to I think when we talk about the collaboration and cooperation part of it, we're seeing it a lot more in business when they're driving these ecosystems where there is shared information, shared resources, etc., where businesses and sometimes even competitors are supporting each other, sharing knowledge and experiences with each other to have better business practices, etc. And also, I mean, in terms of ecosystems, just to support driving particular agendas, whether it's a corporate agenda or altruistic agendas, we're seeing a lot of collaborations between businesses. And that involves leadership being brave enough to sit with the competitor and say, cool guys, we can compete or we can team up and collaborate as a community, right? As a community within our particular industry, let's drive something. And we've seen that a lot more. And I think business leaders have been brave, especially post-COVID, because there's an element of vulnerability which leadership need to have in order to make that decision to say, hey guys, we want to get involved in this. So from a business perspective, that we've really noticed that. Back to the shift in Dr. Joy spoke about, I think, Natasha, you mentioned, in a VUCA world, business agility becomes super important and decisions often need to be made quickly. And that could be a blessing and a curse at the same time, because if you're too hasty on the decision and you make the decision very quickly without including the broader teams, you could make a decision which results in negatively, adversely impacting your business, employee morale shifts. And it's a tricky situation, is how do you include the rest of your team in this decision making, but also allow for it to be a quick process so that these decisions can be made quickly. Just to touch on something which Dr. Joy and I worked on together within my organization, is we created something called the 𝘬𝗀𝗀, right? The 𝘬𝗀𝗀 is a committee of future leaders for this purpose, because otherwise we have a team of executive leadership making decisions at the top, right? Without necessarily the context. And one of the purposes of the 𝘬𝗀𝗀 is to quickly procure insights from the rest of the business to facilitate holistic decision making, so that there's a broader view, so that there is this community and Ubuntu in the decision making, not just traditional decision making based on what literature tells us or based on what the decision makers' experience has shown them, but there's actually this element of community and involvement where people feel heard. And we felt that just implementing those type of metrics from a governance point of view and implementing those type of programs have really helped us now in making better decisions, better employee morale. And I know Dr. Natasha mentioned competitive, effectively, if we can grow those things and facilitate that, it's making us more competitive. Those decisions invariably allow us to become more competitive in the market. So the point I'm making is, whilst Ubuntu may be philosophical, it really does translate into businesses being better businesses, leadership being better leaders. Because to be a good leader and lead through Ubuntu, you have to have those who are following you being able to follow you, and lead by example. And I think if you're including them in the decision, right, and talking to their needs, they feel comfortable, they feel that they can be vulnerable, that they do have a voice, and then they lead, then they're following their leaders by choice, not because of title. And I think that shift's really been important from a leadership point of view and a business point of view.
And what I'm hearing very strongly, and I like that balance of irrespective, if there's one thing in South Africa that we can appreciate is that language. We've got 11 official languages, so we're very careful about the value we put to words. So whether we use the word competitiveness, but the meaning is we still have to be effective and efficient and be successful and sustainable, but the manner in which we're doing it, and that's that whole reconciling people, profit, and planet the whole time. And what I'm hearing very loudly from you is you have to set up the system, the culture. You can't suddenly overnight when COVID hits decide, oh, I'm going to be very consultative in my decision making when the crisis ever arrives. You should have set up that type of system. You should have built that type of leadership already, and that's the key. I just want to highlight, I just read this beautiful comment from Martin Odwa, and I'm probably bastardizing that surname, but Martin from Nairobi said he's listening in from Nairobi in Kenya, and this whole conversation reminds him so much of the philosophy of Harambee, which means pulling together, and which was promoted by their founding president, Jomo Kenyatta, at independence, and which has ensured that we could do good as citizens of our country. Education, health, development, all happened because of this philosophy of connectedness. Thank you so much, Martin. And then I also had a brilliant comment here from 𝗲𝗏, and I'm not even going to try and pronounce her son's name, but 𝗲𝗏 Grace, which, we pride ourselves at Stellenbosch. We say we grow responsible leadership. And she's a proud alumni of USB, and saying, appreciate the engagement as my IFR, which is Institute of Future Research, thesis explored application of ancient wisdom in creative intelligence and foresight. By unearthing the old, we make better sense of the new. Ubuntu is rooted in 𝘁𝗵𝗄, the organic indigenous paradigm of Africa's Khoi and San First Nation. And I'm actually going to invite 𝗲𝗏, to just share a little bit more of your insights with us.
𝘁𝗵𝗄𝙧𝙪, that means ancestral greetings to my alumni, especially to you, Dr. Natasha and Dr. Joy and Yesthiel, for inviting me to engage on this platform. Yes, I am a proud alumni of the IFR, and in 2007, 2008, graduated with a thesis around exploring ancient indigenous wisdom systems, specifically focusing on Africa, China, and India. For that, I went to live with my Khoi and San elders in the Kalahari. I went to live at an ashram in India, and I trained under a Chinese master. The results of that, actually, what brought to light is that all indigenous cultures, we share a very similar worldview. A lot of this, as you know, is rooted then in what we term Ubuntu in South Africa, If we go beneath the bedrock of that, we actually encounter then 𝘁𝗵𝗄. 𝘁𝗵𝗄 is very closer then to what is being practiced today as indigenomics. And maybe you'd want to connect, because we work then as me as an Indigenous rights woman leader and activist. I'm working on the COP27. I work on this ESG, you know, the environmentally, social and governance issues around how we address these oil and gas and carbon challenges. My work then is also, as I say, at a global level with the Indigenous leaders in Australia, in Canada, in South America. We have a United Nations working group on the Indigenous people. So my work has developed out of this MPhil thesis, where I kept to my story, if you want to say, in a way, and approaching this worldview and saying, I see something that perhaps others cannot. But what we do now clearly see is that these Indigenous paradigms, we are the original organic, green, collaborative, creative economy, so to speak. And the modern world is now finding its way back through all these different frameworks, calling it, whether you call it donut economics or you call it green economics. If you take all of that and you accumulate these fields of knowledge and saying, where might this be leading us to? We're going to land back onto this fundamental indigenomics way of looking at the world through a very human lens. In the last year, you may be aware that we've stopped a number of oil and gas projects around South Africa because we have an attachment to the sea. Our people have a very spiritual approach or spirituality to the environment. We read the climate, we can smell the rain 4 days in advance. These things were not taken into account in the Cartesian, objective, scientific way of knowing. And so now we're coming into this very much more intersubjectivity and a way of actually, as Dr. Joy was saying, going on the inside. I also want to add that, you know, what I'm saying has been echoed by Dr. 𝗵𝗶𝗀𝗪𝗪 in a position as the chair of the Club of Rome, working closely with Dr. Morne Mostert at the IFR. They, in fact, 2 months back, launched the 𝘁𝗵𝗪𝗪 Charter of Indigenous Rights for Africa. Again, they're bringing in, from a Swahili perspective, what we've been saying that's known as the UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And I would urge Yesthiel, in your youth co, take what I'm sharing with you and take it forward, because I'm now from 2007 till 2022, I've been walking this road. Are you with me? And we need to hand over the baton to say, this is how much we as academics have done. I started to do my PhD. Stellenbosch was unable to give me a supervisor for that. We then tried at UCT Business School, and I went through that for 1.5 years, through which then, in fact, Professor 𝘁𝗵𝗄𝗃 was one of the supervisors prepared to support my work, and then that, of course. But what I'm saying to you is that there's so much out there of indigenous knowledge that needs to be brought up to the surface to help us chart new pathways of light and hope at this very calamitous time in the world. We need profound thinking. Thank you so much.
Oh, Merle, please come to me. I'll supervise your PhD tomorrow. Joy, you were just
really?
jumping to come in there.
Well, thank you so much. I definitely will. Please drop me your contact details in the chat box, and I will take you up on that offer.
Definitely. No, we definitely need to operationalize this a lot more. And I just want to echo here, 𝘁𝗵𝗪𝗪 has also made a very good point. 𝘁𝗵𝗪𝗪 says, I think it's interesting how we view Ubuntu as a far away concept. We do it every day. This is our life. It's in our bones. It's in who we are. That's why we don't even think about it. I think we just need to find better ways to operationalizing it and giving it a more visible. Take, for example, the ESG. And you find Ubuntu speaks to this in terms of community, the social aspect, building a sustainable ecosystem environment, and of course, governance. maybe a bit weak on accountability by nature. Thanks so much to Lani, also a very good point. But Joy, what you wanted to say something?
I'm just so like excited and enthused about the comment that was made earlier, because I resonate with it at such a deep, deep level, and especially the coming back to the ancients and how, you know, the whole theme of the series was looking the past, the present, and the future, and that past element of it is looking at ancient wisdom. And I definitely agree, is that 360 sort of movement that we usually see. And it's very encouraging to start seeing it also at a global stage when looking at models that are being created around the best leadership competencies that are needed even to drive the SDGs. So we all know that we have these big sustainability development goals that the world will come together to achieve. But what people have been seeing is that these big macro systemic things and shifts don't happen without the inner development goals, which is what now the West has started to create around what are the IDGs, the inner development goals that we need to have to actually move the SDGs. And surprise, surprise, when you look at the competency framework that builds the IDG, and this is like a combination of people in the UK, in New York, in New Jersey, in the west of the USAs, where in big institutions like MIT and then as well, which are considered, you know, kind of a base of knowledge in that space, where Ubuntu was one of the competencies there in the IDGs that was seen as one of the primary movements for the inner development part of the leadership practice, which we usually kind of ignore for me. And I think the point I really wanted to make from the conversation that we're having right now is that it's the revolution isn't out there, and maybe it's not even a revolution. It's the evolution that happens sort of internally and going back. When we're going back to our indigenous ways, we're going back to authentically who we are at a level outside of colonization, for instance, when we look at, you know, countries such as South Africa as well. So that movement is so critical.
So Simon, we've been speaking and we've all kind of been rallied up by the emotive. I don't think there's anyone in this call that don't buy into the idea that Ubuntu is a good philosophy to infuse. But we also live in the real world, and this is South Africa, and we have a lot of challenges in South Africa. And we have, you know, at some point we were the forerunners in terms of activism. You know, we had the highest numbers of toys and active. We are a country that struggle, and that's our lived reality. Yebo Fresh got through this. We got through the noise, we got through the reality, and you built that relationship and partnership in the community. Can you share us a little bit about how did you get that buy-in? And I almost want to go to trust, you know, because trust is also a soft thing, but how did you get the trust and the buy-in from the communities to help you sustain this business model?
Sure. So we deal with food and basic food needs. And if you consider that our clients, people in underserved areas, spend a large portion of their monthly income on food, it's like gold. You don't make decisions rashly about that. When you're not spending out of abundance and you're spending out of necessity, you carefully consider your decision. An example in point would be that you would choose a known brand that is more expensive rather than trusting a cheaper brand that is maybe more economically viable for you, because you cannot risk chancing that portion of money on that new brand. You know the other one, you're going to buy that because it's always worked before, which doesn't make economic sense to lots of people, but it does make sense in that community. So back to your question, is that because we're dealing with something so important and such a main part of people's lives, and there is so much risk attached to it, the trust is huge. And I think there are a couple of things that come to mind, and how do we build that trust? Firstly, we went with an attitude of asking. So we obviously had to make assumptions and prove those assumptions to be real to create a viable business. But there is not, we don't assume that we know everything. So Yebo Fresh is a very agile business. It's a startup by nature, even though we are relatively large, but we are a startup. We have changed and morphed so many times in the last 4 years, because you realize things you didn't know before, and so you have to change everything. So by going with this attitude of, I'm going to ask, I'm going to present what we think, but I'm actually going to ask for your input. And actually, we've got better and better and better at doing that. So not going, hey, we're great, this is what we're offering, you'd be crazy not to accept it. Rather going, okay, well, this is what we think is a good idea. What do you think? And we constantly asking. There's surveys. It's how we talk in client meetings, if we're talking about big projects, or if we're talking about our contact into township retail and spaza owners, business owners, whether informal or not. You know, they are business owners with great intelligence, great experience, great community networks. Like, we'd be foolish not to tap into that from a business point of view. But by spending that little extra time in asking and developing those relationships and asking that question, and we've been able to provide a better product, a better service, and for those, I guess, early adopters, you might call them, they are then evangelical about what we're doing. So makes good business sense to take that approach, but also that's how you build trust. I think the other thing, which is maybe more unique to where we operate, is the fact that we kept going back. Like, we got knocked down many times. So and I think part of building trust, and part of Ubuntu, part of, I guess, without getting soppy, a love relationship, a relationship that's built on trust and security and vulnerability. If I keep pitching up again, that tells you something about me. Like, if a business keeps coming, and we're not just after your money, we are not just after what we can get out of this, we think this is a good thing for you, we're going to keep coming back, despite hijackings, shootings, all sorts of other problems that we face regularly, that we keep coming back. We'll make a plan, we'll get there, we'll do something. I think that proves to people, okay, these guys are not fly-by-nights, they're here for real. We didn't arrive with an app, we arrived with an app plus the solution. Like, we harnessed the two. We could have just thought of an idea. No, we actually did the hard yards. So I think that goes a long way.
Sure, that is so powerful. I'm hearing what you're saying. You know, in South Africa, we greet, we tell people 𝘁𝗲𝙗𝗚, and the meaning of the word 𝘁𝗲𝙗𝗚 is I see you, I see you. You know, it's so deeper than, hey, how is it? Lekker, you know, these horrible greetings. Imagine you meet someone and say, I see you, like namaste. I see you, my soul, the soul in me greets the soul in you. And as you were speaking, Simon, I saw that, and I was reminded by a movie that I watched on Mother Teresa's life. And Mother Teresa, this was a life philosophy. She was here to serve. And when she went into the Indian community, it was obviously there was a lot of distrust because, you know, this Christian woman coming in to corrupt our kids. And she didn't do anything. And she just kept showing up every day. She just sat there. And eventually started talking to the kids and started teaching them the alphabet. But it's that, as you say, you keep showing up, you keep showing up. It brings us back to that relationship is so important. Okay? Before I'm going to trust you, I'm going to see you keep showing up. So thank you for sharing that. Joe, I can't believe our time is just flying. I'm going to ask each of you just for just the last word that you just want to leave. We've got over 80 people listening to this conversation, and I can see things are moving in the spirit of what this conversation, one of them being a PhD being birthed here today. Maybe Dr. Joy, just final reflections. What would you like to share with the audience?
I think I'll read something quickly that I wrote on the topic. And I say, and this was at the end of my PhD, which was like at the core was an Ubuntu kind of finding at the self. And I said, the world needs heroes, a multiplicity of them. In the I am, because we are Ubuntu philosophy, the I of the individual leader is still relevant and important from a self-agency perspective and responsibility. However, the I matters in relation to the well-being of the collective and the planet. And the greatest challenge for all of us is to then try and use Ubuntu as a powerful frame for shared heroism, right? To find a more positive place in the world of business and to go beyond, self-interest and control and towards believing in and supporting others' potential to lead as well, and in sharing of that responsibility of making a meaningful contribution to society at large, essentially. I think those are my remarks that I had in 2016, and they remain pretty much the same as well as I've been working in the space and really intentional about bringing in that wisdom and knowledge in the intervention and the solutions that I'm a part of co-creating within the ecosystems that I belong to. And that's, I think, makes the ownership part of it very much embodied in how I show up as a leader of the tribe, but also just the leader within that space.
Thanks, Dr. Joy. Thanks, Natasha. Just in my closing, what I'd like to say is that I see an opportunity for leadership to embrace servant leadership, to embrace value-based leadership, and to drive those principles within their organization. But on the converse of that, there's also an opportunity to recognize that everybody within their organization and team is different. And if leaders and leadership can embrace that, right? And embrace those different views, those different cultures, and all of that to allow for better decision-making. I think that opportunity, if embraced, can really make businesses, I don't want to say the word competitive, but really do make them competitive from a business point of view. So I encourage the leaders and future leaders to really embrace those philosophies within their businesses, and also not even within their businesses, within the broader communities. I think there's opportunity for leadership to, as we mentioned, shared information, shared knowledge, collaborations, cooperations, towards working to building a better South Africa and a better Africa. So yeah, really positive conversation, and thank you all for your contributions. It's been amazing.
Yeah, and from me, I think it's come up a few times, just the starting point is personal mastery, so our personal journey. I think that's where it really starts. As a leader, you can't lead others unless you can lead yourself. So I think starting there and retooling your own outlook is critical. Something I was considering earlier as we spoke is that the world is moving at such a fast pace. Things are changing in an amazing way. We are so connected globally now that decisions need to be made fast. Businesses are changing every 5 seconds. Things aren't the same each quarter, let alone kind of in a decade's time. The old way of doing business is not there anymore. You can't have one leader that steers that ship, and what they say is how it goes. That, like, you're deluded if you think that's the case. You need to master yourself, but then also be able to open yourself up to giving agency to others, equipping them to deal with that agency, and then having a level of humility and security that allows for that kind of blessing of information to come back to you so that you can guide an organization in the right direction. And I completely agree with you still. Like, it's a competitive advantage these days to be thinking in that way, with the world going the way it is and business morphing the way it is. This is not a fundamental change. This is actually just a reality check that says this is the way it should be done. This is business. So it's just a retooling and a mind shift. And I think that starts with each of us.
I don't want to summarize what just went on, because I think I'll just mess it all up. I really want to say a thank you to these three amazing people for your time, but also the insights that you dropped. I want to say thank you to Kerry for this wonderful opportunity to showcase this conversation, this important topic, and the beautiful way in which you've set it up for us. For the business school to create these platforms for these conversations to happen, and for people like 𝗪𝗲 that is out there and doing it and living it, and Yesthiel in their businesses growing these things. I do want us to encourage Stellenbosch Business School is about growing responsible leadership. Like Joyce said, the narrative is being owned by the global north. We have to get in there, we have to infuse it, and the only way you get in there is by doing the research and by writing the paper. So I encourage you, I welcome you to come and speak to me about that. In closing, I am going to borrow a few words from a few people that are my favorites. And if you can bear with me for a second here, let me just get my slideshow going. So I'm a typical teacher. I can always throw a few slides together. So Rumi said, yesterday I was clever, so I wanted to change the world. Today I'm wise, so I'm changing myself. Just because you are right does not mean I am wrong. You just haven't seen life from my side. Steve Biko says, the great powers of the world may have done wonders in giving the world an industrial and military look, but the great gift still has to come from Africa, giving the world a more humane face. And then our very beloved 𝘁𝗵𝗪𝗏, what counts in life is not the mere fact that we have lived. It is what difference we have made to the lives of others that will determine the significance of the life that we lead. And with that, thank you for joining us, and thank you for letting me hold this conversation. Kerry, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. Gosh, I'm feeling a little emotional actually about all these thoughts. I must say there's so much food for thought, and I think that this kind of a conversation is really only just getting going. I really do think it's worth revisiting next year. So, you know, again, thank you. You know, what we hope from these sessions is that people leave feeling better than what they did before they joined, in terms of equipped to lead, also understanding their own impact and their possible impact. So I think, you know, Simon, you mentioned we need to master ourselves so that the blessing of information can come. And I think what a beautiful way of describing it. You know, we need to be open to those, open to our own growth, and open to the blessing of feedback, so that we can move forward. So again, thank you everybody. We are 2 minutes over time. I wish everyone a wonderful Thursday going forward, and we will feed back to everybody in terms of our forthcoming series of webinars next year. Thank you very much.